I didn't lose my life in a single moment. I lost it in pauses. In the seconds where I almost spoke, then didn't. In the moments where I knew what I felt, then chose silence. In the years where I believed time would be more patient than it was. I thought staying quiet was harmless. I thought silence was neutral. I was wrong. For a long time, I believed I was simply careful. Observant. The kind of person who thought things through before acting. I watched more than I spoke. I listened more than I asserted. People described me as calm, thoughtful, easy to be around. I accepted those descriptions because they sounded like virtues. What no one saw was how much effort it took to remain that way. Every conversation became a calculation. Every disagreement softened before it reached my mouth. Every opinion filtered until it was safe enough not to disturb the room. I learned how to make myself agreeable without completely disappearing, at least, that's what I told myself. The truth is, disappearing doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, politely, with good intentions. I told myself I was avoiding conflict. That speaking up would only complicate things. That not every feeling deserved expression. I believed restraint was maturity and patience was wisdom. And for a while, it worked. My life stayed stable. Relationships remained intact. No bridges burned. No scenes made. I moved forward quietly, consistently, without friction. That smoothness became my proof that silence was the right choice. But something subtle began to change. I stopped feeling relief after choosing quiet. Instead, I felt hollow. As if I had swallowed something unfinished. Words I didn't say lingered longer than the conversations themselves. Decisions I didn't influence followed me home. I told myself that was normal. That everyone feels unheard sometimes. That life requires compromise. So I stayed quiet again. And again. Over time, silence stopped being something I chose. It became something I defaulted to. I stopped checking whether my voice wanted to speak, I assumed it shouldn't. That assumption shaped everything. I stayed in situations that didn't feel right because leaving would require explanation. I accepted paths that felt misaligned because questioning them would raise concerns. I told myself that as long as nothing was obviously wrong, I had no reason to disturb the balance. Balance became my priority. Not truth. Not desire. Balance. People trusted me because I was consistent. They relied on me because I was flexible. They confided in me because I didn't challenge them. I became a safe presence, someone who absorbed tension instead of reflecting it. I mistook that role for belonging. Inside, I felt increasingly distant from my own life. Days passed without leaving impressions. Achievements felt muted. Disappointments felt familiar. Everything blended into a manageable sameness. I wasn't unhappy. I was absent. The scariest part was how easy it was to justify. I had reasons for everything. Practical explanations. Logical defenses. I could explain my choices to anyone, except myself. Whenever a quiet dissatisfaction surfaced, I dismissed it. I told myself it wasn't important enough to address. That making a fuss would only create problems. That timing mattered, and now wasn't the time. Later, I promised myself. Later became my favorite word. Later, I would speak up. Later, I would choose differently. Later, when things were more stable. Later never arrived. Instead, time kept moving, indifferent, efficient, unstoppable. It carried my silence forward and turned it into structure. My quiet choices hardened into patterns. Patterns became expectations. One day, without warning, I realized I no longer recognized my own preferences. When asked what I wanted, my mind went blank. Not because I wanted nothing, but because I hadn't practiced answering honestly in years. That terrified me. Because it meant my silence had done more than protect peace. It had erased reference points. I no longer knew where my limits were, what mattered most to me, or how much I was willing to risk for my own truth. I had trained myself to be adaptable at the expense of being defined. The moment that finally broke me wasn't dramatic. It was small, almost forgettable. Someone else spoke up, confidently, imperfectly, and the room adjusted around them. Not everyone agreed. Not everything went smoothly. But the world didn't end. I felt something sharp and painful in my chest. Not envy. Grief. I realized how many moments like that I had surrendered. How often I had chosen silence not because it was right, but because it was easier. How many versions of my life had passed quietly because I hadn't spoken when it mattered. I went home that night and sat in the dark, replaying years of unsaid words. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I couldn't ignore: what has my silence cost me? The answer arrived slowly, not as a list, but as a feeling. It had cost me time. It had cost me direction. It had cost me myself. I didn't lose my life because someone took it from me. I gave it away, one quiet moment at a time. And the most painful realization of all? Time never noticed. It kept moving, collecting everything I didn't claim. Once I asked myself what my silence had cost me, the answer refused to stay abstract. It became physical. I felt it in my chest when I agreed to things I didn't want. In my jaw when I smiled through conversations that drained me. In the constant, low-level fatigue that no amount of sleep ever touched. Silence wasn't calm anymore. It was pressure. I started noticing how often I rehearsed words I would never say. Entire conversations played out in my head, honest, clear, sometimes even kind, and then disappeared the moment I faced the real person. What came out instead was something safer. Smaller. Easier to accept. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I was choosing was erasure. The hardest part was realizing how deeply this habit had shaped my identity. I wasn't just quiet in conflict. I was quiet everywhere. I avoided expressing preferences. I softened reactions before they were visible. I learned how to anticipate what others wanted and adjusted before they asked. People loved that about me. They said I was understanding. Low maintenance. Easy to be with. Someone who didn't make things complicated. I didn't realize that what they loved was my absence. The internal conflict grew slowly, like something swelling beneath the surface. I became irritable over small things and numb toward big ones. I felt resentment without knowing where to place it. No one was doing anything wrong, and that made it worse. I had no villain to blame. Every time I considered speaking up, fear stepped in immediately. Not fear of being yelled at or rejected outright, fear of subtle consequences. Of awkwardness. Of being misunderstood. Of changing how people saw me. I had built my entire sense of safety around being predictable. What if speaking changed that? What if my truth disappointed people who had come to rely on my quiet agreement? That fear was powerful because it wasn't dramatic. It was social. Relational. The kind of fear that doesn't scream but persuades. I told myself things like, this isn't worth the trouble. It'll pass. Not everything needs to be said. Now isn't the right time. Those phrases became my internal sedatives. The breaking point didn't come in an argument. It came in a moment of unexpected honesty, from someone else. I was listening to a person talk about a decision they had made that didn't please everyone. They weren't defensive. They weren't apologetic. They acknowledged the discomfort openly and accepted it as part of choosing. They looked tired. But they looked real. Something inside me cracked. I realized how much effort I had put into avoiding exactly that kind of tiredness, the tiredness that comes from being visible. I had chosen the exhaustion of suppression instead, because it was quieter and easier to hide. That night, the weight of all the unsaid things caught up with me. I sat alone and let myself imagine the future honestly for the first time. Not ideally, realistically. I saw myself continuing this way, still quiet, still agreeable, still careful. Still respected. Still trusted. Still absent. The image filled me with panic. Because nothing in that future forced me to change. I could live like that forever and be praised for it. No crisis. No collapse. Just a life that passed smoothly while I watched from the inside. That realization terrified me more than any potential conflict ever had. I understood then that silence wasn't neutral. It was a choice. A choice that favored comfort over clarity. Harmony over honesty. Acceptance over authenticity. And once I saw it as a choice, continuing to stay quiet felt like consent. The physical symptoms worsened. I woke up anxious without knowing why. My thoughts looped endlessly. I felt like I was carrying a version of myself that was never allowed to arrive anywhere. I began to resent my own restraint. That resentment was new and dangerous. Because resentment doesn't disappear when ignored. It either turns inward or explodes outward. I felt it pressing against the boundaries I had built, looking for release. I knew then that something had to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But deliberately. I didn't need to speak everywhere. I didn't need to confront everyone. But I needed to stop silencing myself automatically. I needed to let my voice exist even when it made things slightly harder. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought fear. Because the first time you break a long habit of silence, it feels like stepping into danger. Your body reacts as if you're about to be punished. Your mind floods with worst-case scenarios. I felt all of that. And still, I knew that continuing to stay quiet was no longer safe. Not for my relationships. Not for my mental health. Not for my life. I reached a point where the fear of speaking became smaller than the fear of disappearing completely. That was new. And once that balance shifted, I understood something clearly: the next silence would be a lie. The first time I spoke, my voice betrayed me. It wasn't steady. It wasn't confident. It didn't sound like the version of myself I had rehearsed in my head for years. It came out slower, quieter, edged with hesitation, and still, it changed everything. Because I didn't take it back. The moment wasn't dramatic. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just a conversation where I felt the familiar pressure to stay quiet, and chose not to. I said what I felt. Simply. Without defending it. Without over-explaining. Without trying to soften it into something easier to accept. The room went quiet. That silence used to terrify me. It was the silence I always rushed to fill, to fix, to neutralize. This time, I let it exist. My body reacted as if I had done something dangerous. My heart raced. My hands trembled slightly. Every instinct screamed at me to apologize, to laugh it off, to say I didn't mean it that way. I stayed still. And something unexpected happened. No one exploded. No one rejected me. No one left. The world adjusted. Not perfectly. Not comfortably. But it adjusted. That moment didn't solve my life. It didn't undo years of silence. What it did was far more important: it proved that my fear had been louder than reality. I began to understand how much of my life had been shaped not by actual consequences, but by imagined ones. I started speaking more, carefully at first. Not everywhere. Not all the time. Just in the moments where silence felt dishonest. Where staying quiet would mean disappearing again. Each time, it felt wrong before it felt right. I disappointed people. That part was real. Some looked surprised. Some uncomfortable. A few subtly pulled away. I saw recalibration happening in real time, expectations shifting, dynamics changing. And it hurt. But beneath the hurt was something I hadn't felt in years. Ground. For the first time, my words and my inner world were aligned. I didn't have to carry unfinished conversations home with me. I didn't replay moments obsessively, wondering what I should have said. Even when the outcome wasn't ideal, it was complete. I began to notice how much energy silence had been draining from me. How much effort it took to constantly manage impressions, anticipate reactions, absorb tension. Speaking didn't remove difficulty, it redistributed it. Instead of carrying everything inside, I allowed some of it to exist in the open. That changed how time felt. Days stopped blurring together. Moments gained weight. Decisions felt consequential again, not because they were perfect, but because they were chosen. I learned something uncomfortable along the way: some relationships only survive when you stay quiet. That was a grief I hadn't expected. There were people who preferred me agreeable, adaptable, endlessly accommodating. When I stopped playing that role, the connection thinned. Not dramatically, just gradually, politely, the way distance often appears. I let them go. Not angrily. Not resentfully. Just honestly. Other relationships changed in quieter ways. Boundaries appeared where none had existed. Conversations became less smooth but more real. I was no longer the emotional buffer everyone leaned on, and that was a loss for them, and a relief for me. I started to feel tired in a different way. Not the exhaustion of suppression, but the fatigue of participation. Of showing up fully. Of being seen. That kind of tiredness was honest. And honesty, I learned, is sustainable. I stopped measuring my life by how peaceful it looked and started measuring it by how present I felt inside it. I stopped asking whether my words would disrupt harmony and started asking whether silence would cost me more. Sometimes, the answer was still silence, but now it was chosen, not defaulted. That difference mattered. Looking back, I see how easily I confused quiet with kindness, restraint with maturity, adaptability with wisdom. I thought being low impact made me a good person. What it made me was absent. If there is a confession at the heart of this story, it's this: I didn't lose my life because I failed. I lost it because I waited. I waited for the right time. For the perfect wording. For permission that was never coming. Time didn't punish me for that. It simply kept moving. I don't believe anymore that staying quiet is harmless. Silence shapes lives. It becomes structure. It turns days into repetitions and years into habits. Speaking up didn't make me fearless. It made me real. And reality, even when it's messy, even when it disappoints, is something you can stand on. If someone listening to this recognizes themselves in my silence, hear this: you don't need to be loud to exist. You don't need to be aggressive to be honest. You don't need to justify your voice to earn it. The cost of staying quiet is invisible, until it isn't. I stayed quiet for too long. And time took everything else. Now, even when my voice shakes, even when words come out imperfectly, I choose to speak. Because losing approval hurts. But losing yourself happens quietly. And I've already lived that version of my life. I'm not going back.